This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
If you try to trace the origin of Western philosophy, you always land on one name, Aristotle.
Always.
He defined logic, he cataloged nature, he basically systematized thought. He's the foundation. We just accept this.
Right.
But today, we are putting a massive asterisk next to that foundation. We're diving deep into a simple but really profound question. Is the philosophical conclusion Aristotle is most famous for, the unmoved mover, actually his own work?
And this is a really important distinction. This is a deep dive into historical structure, not just, a stylistic debate.
Okay.
We're zeroing in on the unmoved mover theory, which you find mostly in Metaphysics, Book Lambda, Part 2. For most people, this is it. This is the peak of his system.
So the grand finale.
His ultimate cosmic theology, exactly. But when you really look at the evidence, the reality of the Lyceum, the documents themselves, the 200 years of history after he died, the data strongly suggests this idea is, well, it's the philosophical equivalent of a later architectural addition.
A roof.
A brilliant, necessary roof added by later thinkers.
That metaphor, a roof, is so key here. We're going to treat this text not as some single inspired manuscript, but more like a collection of research notes.
That were eventually compiled, edited,
and maybe even supplemented to satisfy a later historical need. Our whole mission today is to understand why this celebrated conclusion, this ultimate answer, might actually be an anomaly, something created by an editor trying to give the world a unified system.
And you need to know this because it determines how we read every other line he wrote.
How so?
If we accept the unmoved mover uncritically, we're basically defining Aristotle as a theologian first. But if we view it with suspicion, we redefine him completely, he becomes a methodologist or research director.
Okay, let's unpack the concept itself then. When we read Book Lambda, Part 2, what are the definitive characteristics of this unmoved mover? What makes it feel so complete?
The characteristics are very clear, they're powerful, and, this is the important part, they are entirely transcendent.
Meaning outside the physical world.
Completely. The unmoved mover is described as an entity that does not move itself, yet it's the ultimate cause of all movement and change in the entire cosmos.
Good.
It's complete, it's eternal, and its whole essence is just pure intellect contemplating itself. It's the ultimate self-sufficient reason for being. It is, the end of the explanatory road.
And here's where the philosophical tension instantly spikes. Because this ultimate top-down explanation seems to just completely contradict the entire methodological scaffolding that Aristotle built his whole career on.
Precisely. Aristotle's foundational genius was in his method, which was consistently bottom-up.
Inductive reasoning.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. His approach was empirical. You start with observation, you look at specific facts, you categorize them, and you find the causes within the things themselves, immanent causes.
So he's saying the reason an acorn grows into an oak is found in the acorn, in its own potential and form, not by pointing to some ideal oak floating in the ether.
Exactly. But the unmoved mover just shatters this pattern. It is not an immanent cause. It is a top-down, transcendent principle. It's outside the world it supposedly governs.
Which creates this fundamental incoherence right at the supposed peak of his system.
A huge one.
And it's not a minor tension either. I mean, if you look elsewhere in the metaphysics, Aristotle spends a massive amount of time actively dismantling systems that rely on these kinds of first principles.
That's the crucial evidence. Look at books Mu and New of Metaphysics. Those books are basically a sustained attack on Platonic and Pythagorean ideas.
Ideas that rely on what? Mysterious numbers, a world of ideas.
All of it. Transcendent first principles that are used to explain reality, he saw them as dead ends.
So he spent his career arguing that transcendent principles actually stop inquiry. Because once you name the ideal, you stop investigating the real thing.
He was philosophically allergic to ideas that shut down exploration. So the question for us, for you is, why would this scholar, who so consistently rejected these ultimate causes in books M and N, suddenly install an even more ultimate transcendent principle, this pure self-thinking mind, right at the top of his system?
The break in his method is just too jarring.
It is. It demands an explanation beyond just, oh, he changed his mind.
And it gets even weirder when you realize how similar the mover is to an earlier Platonic idea he supposedly rejected.
Yes. Structurally, it's almost identical to the demiurge that Plato describes in the Timaeus.
The cosmic craftsman.
Right. It's an outside intellect that provides order, not by creating, but by acting as a model, an object of desire that the whole cosmos strives to imitate. It's the very style of explanation Aristotle spent decades trying to get away from.
So the unmoved mover is basically the world of ideas, just repackaged as a single mind.
In essence, yes. For Aristotle to suddenly adopt this top-down Platonic model feels deeply unnatural given his entire life's project. The stage is set for some kind of disruption.
So if the philosophy itself doesn't quite add up, we have to turn to history. We need to recalibrate our image of Aristotle, away from the solitary thinker
The cloistered philosopher in his study.
and towards the reality of his actual job. What was Aristotle really doing in Athens?
He was first and foremost an administrator, a research director. For about a decade, he ran the Lyceum, which was this sprawling educational and research community.
So his main job wasn't to finish his magnum opus.
No. It was to design the structure, the mechanisms, the whole division of labor for intellectual inquiry on a massive scale.
A massive scale is the key phrase there. We sort of picture ancient philosophers with a few devoted students. What was the actual scope of the Lyceum?
Oh, it was a proto-university, a think tank. You might have had a dozen core teachers, but the whole enterprise. When you count students, short-term collaborators, the external network of officials and doctors who fed them data, the sources suggest dozens. Maybe up to 100 people at any given time.
100 people. Okay, now that makes sense of his big projects. You can suddenly visualize the logistics of a team investigating over 150 different political constitutions for the Politia.
That's a massive data aggregation task. It's institutional work, not a lone genius just thinking. The same goes for his huge biological studies. That required teams of observers all over the Mediterranean. Aristotle's real genius was designing the system to generate and organize that knowledge.
This reframes the metaphysics completely.
Yeah.
If he's managing a research hub, we shouldn't see it as a finished book. It's more like,
Internal orientation material.
right, a welcome packet for new students joining this huge project.
Precisely. Think of it as the Lyceum's intellectual toolkit. Books alpha and beta set the scope. Here's what scholarship is, and here are the big unsolved problems. Gamma lays down the ground rules, the law of non-contradiction, to keep the sophists out,
And then you get the categories and the four causes.
which are the basic analytic tools you give to every single student. It's a roadmap for keeping the research going.
And that's why books M and N are so important in this context.
Vitally important. They're basically a warning to the students. Don't get sidetracked by those other schools. Don't fall for Plato's transcendent ideals. The answers are here, in the facts. The whole collection is designed to keep exploration open.
So for the unmoved mover to suddenly show up in Book Lambda with the definitive closed-loop answer.
It looks like a foreign element dropped into a scientific manual.
Okay, so we have the philosophical anomaly, we have the administrative context for open-ended inquiry. Now we get to the historical opportunity.
The 200-year gap.
That gap is everything. After Aristotle died, his internal working papers, his lecture notes, drafts, all the stuff that makes up the metaphysics, they basically disappeared from public view.
Just gone.
Hoarded and stored, and often in really bad conditions.
Where were they found, and what kind of shape were they in?
They were rediscovered in Asia Minor and eventually brought to Rome, where they were edited around the 1st century BC by a man named Andronicus of Rhodes. And just imagine the state of that material.
A total mess. Scrolls damaged by moisture, mixed handwriting from different people, fragments of notes, no clear order. Andronicus had to put the Humpty Dumpty of Aristotle's thought back together again.
Which means the opportunity for, well, for significant reorganization, supplementation, even subtle addition wasn't just possible, it was almost unavoidable.
He wasn't just a transcriber, he was an editor, in the strongest sense of the word. He was defining the structure of what would become Western philosophy.
But what was the motivation? Why would he feel the need to add that roof to impose a closed system on what was clearly an open research collection?
The answer is the intellectual climate of his time, the 1st century BC, the rise of what we call Middle Platonism.
And what was their main philosophical project?
Harmonization. The primary goal was to merge Plato and Aristotle, the two great pillars of thought, into a single, unified, coherent philosophical system. They couldn't have these two giants in conflict. They needed one system that could provide a complete metaphysical and theological foundation.
And Aristotle the administrator, who was happy to stop with the four causes and just keep observing, was fundamentally incomplete for that project.
Exactly. For the Middle Platonists, Aristotle needed an ultimate cause to close the loop. He needed a transcendent principle to make him compatible with Plato's transcendent world of ideas. Without a theological roof, he's just a guy who runs a science department. With the unmoved mover, he becomes a cosmic theologian.
And Lambda the Second was the perfect fit.
It perfectly satisfied that later historical and intellectual need.
It's like finding the last piece of a puzzle that wasn't actually designed to have a final piece. And this editorial choice had huge world-altering consequences later on, especially in the Middle Ages.
Oh, the consequences were decisive, and they lasted for 1,000 years. When Aristotle was rediscovered in the High Middle Ages, Lambda II was instantly canonized. It's what transformed Aristotle from a researcher into the philosopher,
The ultimate authority.
whose insights were seen as the definitive support for monotheistic theology.
The unmoved mover just became the monotheistic god. The sources show how this structure completely permeated medieval cosmology. It turned physics into like an emotional theological drama.
Yes, it was an absolutely brilliant theological repurposing. The motion of the planets and stars was interpreted as the sphere's yearning or longing for the perfection of God, the mover.
Wow.
And even mundane physics, like a rock falling to the ground, was interpreted as the rock's natural movement of love toward the divine center of the universe.
That reframing is incredible. They took a concept that was likely an editorial fix and made it the fundamental emotional driver of the entire cosmos.
And so Lambda II became the unquestionable roof of medieval cosmology. The system was now a closed theological structure. You couldn't question the mover within that framework. The Lyceum director had been irrevocably turned into the cosmic authority.
So where does that leave us today? Do modern scholars just say Lambda II is an outright forgery?
No, not universally. It's more nuanced than that. It's important to remember that the manuscript traditions are consistent, and a lot of the technical language is clearly Aristotelian, so you can't just call it a crude forgery. But the sources compel us to adopt a stance of, let's say, strong suspicion.
And that suspicion is rooted in all the factors we've discussed. The philosophical break with his other work.
The lack of fit with his educational project.
The 200-year gap, the messy state of the papers.
And crucially, the very clear motivation of the Middle Platonists to unify his thought,
Right.
given all those structural flusses, to just uncritically accept Lambda II as Aristotle's final word is, paradoxically, the more unnatural position to take.
So the key takeaway is that Aristotle probably did not believe the world could be explained by a single ultimate transcendent principle.
That's the core insight.
I think this repositions his entire legacy in a really exciting way. We should stop seeing him as the lone sage who finished philosophy.
I think so. You could argue he was an overrated philosopher in the sense that he didn't solve everything, but he was a vastly undervalued research organization designer.
I love that.
His real genius wasn't finding the final answer. It was in designing the machine, the Lyceum, for the continuous, rigorous, and open-ended exploration of questions.
Which is an incredible legacy. So when we read the metaphysics, we're not necessarily reading the pure thought of a lone genius. We might be reading the required completion mandated by a later historical era that desperately needed its foundations to be secure.
And that's the provocative thought we want to leave you with. If the most famous ultimate truth of this foundational thinker was, in all likelihood, added centuries later by an editor with an agenda, what other voices of the era might we be mistaking for the original voice of genius in the other canonical texts we all rely on?
It forces you to constantly question the historical context of every single idea.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.